Hello and welcome back to the Rhetoric Reviewed podcast. And in the last episode 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about my general thoughts, my unpacking of the whole Charlie Kirk assassination and contextualizing it in sort of the modern day. So if you want to watch that video, go ahead. But there's a few things I would like to correct primarily and then go into some of the more interesting parts about this whole situation, which I only uncovered due to the fact of this happening. So the first thing I would like to correct is that I made the historical comparison in terms of political scope, power, influence to someone like Mount Martin Luther King, right? Obviously on possibly opposite sides of the political spectrum, but then I made the realization talking to some people and such that Malcolm X would probably be a better example, what with the more subversive religious takes and all of that. Not much else is really similar, but in terms of influence and possibly the way that these people might go down in history, absolutely that is an argument that can be made. So after that, I think let's go into more of the details about what I feel about the institutions of today and what it means to be part of the establishment, and why I believe that this whole assassination has unearthed some of that truth for me and hopefully for you after watching this video. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is what the contemporary status is when it comes to influence, power, and all of these different dynamics in politics. Excuse me. So more than ever, even in the past with the invention of television and radio, social media has been a new paradigm for different people and politicians to share their experiences and make sure their word gets across to as many people as possible. It also has the added benefit, similar to TV, is that it's very subversive in the way that it influences people, which is, it's not always noticed. You can do a lot more discreet propaganda, and there's a lot more reach, and people are addicted to their phones, which means that marketing and advertising is just so much easier when it comes to influence. This is the reason why I believe that not only was the Trump administration more effective with this, or Trump campaign in the 2024 election, this from now on is going to be the main way that people in politics are going to interact with, not even politicians, but people involved in politics will interact with the public, right? This will be through podcasts, videos, all these different things that are only becoming more clear as being the main way, everyone's on social media. And that means that social media is the main way we have to look at influence and really consider how people are interacting with it or not, or rather whether or not politicians and public figures are actually engaging with social media in the way that is beneficial to their own ends. And to this degree, I think Charlie Kirk is more effective. Not only did he have one of the longest tenures in the conservative or in just the general online politics movement, starting in I believe like 2015 when it comes to his college campus visits and such. But he had the most influence when it came to the iconic, right? Who is the face of right-wing internet? This is Charlie Kirk, and I was not too big of a fan of his work. However, even I can acknowledge this. And based on this fact, I think it's interesting to see how there's no one really like him on the right. And obviously, if you watch my past thing, you would probably know that I'm slightly more right-leaning. But even then, I don't believe that people like, Ben Shapiro, God forbid, like Nick Fuentes, are even a good representation, nor do they have a semi-good reputation with the general public. Of course, there is a lot of misinformation and a lot of Charlie Kirk hate that has been going on as of late, and I think that is an inevitability with his size, but the amount of solidarity over his assassination really shows the value people have for his style of approach despite his beliefs. And that brings us back to how traditionally things are done. And this is where we get a bit more into the establishment and how, you know, the whole dynamic between politics, influence, and media works. So traditionally, well, it was newspapers and these bigger news media, right? Because you didn't really have independent journalism, you didn't really have the funds to do so and start your own journalism company, and it was really hard to get on TV or radio. This means that a lot of the news sources were, of course, less politically divisive as it is now today, but also it happened to have a lot more control when it came to what was being put out there. This means that there's less space for individual actors to come out and be exceptional. And that is what made a lot of these 20th century and 19th century influencers and public figures even that more impressive. It's because they had to not only engage with the new upcoming technology, they had to subvert that technology and do something on their own. For example, you would hold rallies, you would do grassroots things, you would put out things on newspapers, not as like an owner or anything of your own, production of intellectual property. Instead, you are engaging with something that's pre-established. But with the internet, that's so much more different, and this is where these power dynamics comes in. Where nowadays, we're back in the day, and especially in smaller cities or countries, it's much harder to use money in politics because, again, it's much smaller, and also because, sorry, it's different in the way money is being and power is being used, in that the government isn't the only thing that has a lot of influence anymore, and the rise of billionaires, especially after the whole early 20th century, trust breaking stuff, that has been more significant as well. And of course, this whole tangent, money's always been in politics. It's just different now because it's easier to reach more people. Not everyone read the news or was literate back then, but now everyone is on social media or has some access to legacy media, whether through television or newspaper. That is the ultimate point of this entire section. So based on this, what makes Charlie Kirk different and Turning Point USA different? And I think what makes it different is that it's inherently anti-establishment in both its roots, its purpose, and its messaging, but also it's an institution which rejects, which is only able to stay alive in a rejection of something, right? For example, it's we've talked about before how counterculture or the antithesis of culture always has to it's fixed on the fact that there is an original culture. So the very origin of even Make America Great Again rests on the fact that America isn't great, or that USA isn't where it is religiously, or whatever these values that he had were. And this, perceived lack of a certain, moral quality, or certain just quality in general in America, is a direct indicator that this Charlie Kirk was anti-establishment, and his organization was built on that very fact, right? Turning Point USA is anti-establishment. Which is where the question came in for me, which is how can Charlie Kirk be anti-establishment but also have such a pivotal role in the Trump administration, be close with Trump, and also have a real influence on possibly helping the 2024 election with all of his efforts and his large media presence online. And which is interesting because, theoretically, if you're a Turning Point USA, you're Charlie Kirk, and you want to create meaningful social change in the United States of America, of course getting into the government would be very, very useful, or at least having connections. However, as we've already seen, none of this is really possible from an establishment side. America has a very long tradition of not having religion being married to the government, and therefore a lot of Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA's religious-based goals are not achievable. So why then are they connected to the Trump? Are they connected to the Trump administration? And the answer is that they aren't. Turning Point USA is a distinctly private sector, non-establishment organization which is trying to create social change, not on a level that is unprecedented in the past, only because it is possible in the present. Nowhere else in history would you really find this sort of unified movement, because it's very hard to coordinate people across the vast distances of America to one cohesive unit. Obviously, this has been done before in the past, but it's just been amplified so much, both in numbers due to population growth, but also because of technological improvements. Basically, it's anti-establishment because it can't acknowledge the government as a meaningful way, as a means to change, because it hasn't been the means to change, and it will never be. So that raises the question, right? Charlie Kirk and TPUSA were inherently anti-establishment. But he is also, very clearly was a right-wing person. So where then is the left-wing Charlie Kirk? And therein lies the question with this video. Because a lot of people who hate Charlie Kirk say that his rhetoric was hateful. And in some cases, I can see why they might think that. However, the answer to hate speech, any speech, is more speech, and overruling that speech. Charlie Kirk created a whole foundation to espouse his views onto the American public, and he was largely successful. He created this whole media infrastructure that revolutionized and pioneered the right-wing media backlash that we've been seeing over the last 2 or 3 years. But where is this on the other side? Because one of the also hallmarks of sort of, I guess, like neo-Marxist thinking, right, intersectionality, all that stuff, is Lenin's constant revolution, similar to what I said about Turning Point USA. These organizations and movements can only exist if there's something to fight, and they can't really exist on maintaining the status quo, because there's nothing to do once you create these standards. And the left likes to claim that, right, like, things aren't progressive enough. We don't have enough rights for, interest group X. That's a very similar thing to what Charlie Kirk is saying in principle. There is a, social malady that we see, and we want a means to change that. However, there is no left-wing Charlie Kirk. That's the weirdest thing. Despite having the same fundamental idea of that the establishment is bad and therefore we must prey on the establishment, or at least pressure them to make change, there is nothing like Turning Point USA, and with its breadth, its size, all of these things, and there is no one like Charlie Kirk. If I ask anyone to point out a reasonable member of the left who is representative of a large movement on the left, who would you say? There is not a person. You might point to someone like Hassan Piker. However, he has no in-person persona, and he's now almost labeled a domestic terrorist or something. Clearly not a good example, right? Despite what you might say about the current administration labeling and stuff, there is not really a really good example for a left-wing Charlie Kirk. And what that tells us is that these sorts of movements are really popular, especially since like the early 20th century, because they are subversive, and we have not this addiction, but we have this tendency to value change and subverting existing establishments. And you might say this is just an Enlightenment, like just tradition, the Western tradition, but it's weird because the lack of a large organization or movement, especially with the resources today, indicates that there's not much to change, or there isn't actually a basis in which they can convince people to go along with this sort of change. And that leads me to the point that, in fact, despite both sides not wanting to be the establishment, the existence and continuance of Turning Point USA is in and of itself proof that it is not the establishment. Right, and obviously there's conspiracy theories like, the establishment killed Charlie Kirk for speaking against it and such. But it's strange. The left wing has no need. There is no social pressure or even demand or appetite from the American people to have a left wing Charlie Kirk or Turning Point USA, because they are the establishment already. When you see these companies, the government, the previous government, all these different places bowing down to, for example, transgender ideology, whether or not I think it's correct, right? It is a symbol of the establishment agreeing with the movement. And the movement was never coherent, right? Of course, when it comes to all the woke queer stuff. But it seems significantly different with Turning Point USA in the fact that it'll likely last despite there being a Trump administration and despite there being, severe connections between the regime and Turning Point USA. But it's, as I've, continuously said, it's strange how there is a connection, but there is not enough of a connection where Turning Point USA ceases to exist. So one of the philosophies we talk a lot about, again, is that a counterculture can never be the same thing. It can never last if it becomes the status quo. See, we saw the same thing with pop, and I'll make a video about this soon. But pop music does not. It's not subversive, it's not good anymore, and it's all slop. There's nothing good being created in the last 10 years because it's lost its original purpose of subverting the, social norms of like the early 70s or 60s, right? And something similar, I think, happened with the left-wing movement, the left-wing progressive movement. Sorry, I don't want to, rag on all like left people who lean left of the center. But I think something similar happened where they got their victories and they ceased to exist as a coherent movement. Yet, again, if the Trump administration was so bad and so evil, you would think that there would be something like a Turning Point USA for the left, but there is not. And that reason is because despite there being a Trump administration, they are not in full controls of the levers of power when it comes to institutions and social institutions like government, like universities, like companies. And despite all you might try, that isn't going to happen. And all of this to say, the absence of a left-wing Charlie Kirk is an indication that there isn't enough appetite for a counterculture or a counterexample or a fighting back against the establishment, because the establishment is already on the left-wing side, despite the quote-unquote regime being a Republican regime. And this is why Turning Point USA lives on today, despite Charlie Kirk's death and despite many months of the Trump presidency. And it's only been growing in popularity since, even before his death, because there is still work to be done. On the other hand, the absence of his counterpart is an indication that there is not work to be done quite yet, or at least the pendulum still swings to the right, and it is still going because there's still a lot of leveling out to be done. However, should there come a point where it goes so far right that is, we're in 1984 or whatever the hell, right? Then could we possibly expect a Turning Point USA of the left? So a bit of a shorter video. I talked a bit differently today. I feel like a little bit, less rambly, more direct, but still no scripts. 31 episodes of no scripts. But yeah, if you have any comments, thoughts, discussion points, leave it in the comment section down below. Be respectful, all of that cool stuff. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.